Hello YouTube vintage stereo collectors. Today I want to talk a little more about NAD, New Acoustic Dimension. This is one here that I'm just finishing the restoration on. And this is sort of a 30+ year update on these. And I'll tell you why. Back in the mid 80s when I was a bench tech at a stereo shop, we had this line of amplifiers. And it was being sold alongside Yamahas and Luxmans and Techniques. And what was interesting about it was at the time, the salespeople and the bench tech didn't think very much of these. They sold like hotcakes, and they were cheaper to buy. They weren't as powerful, but they sold like crazy. They hit the right price point and they had the right sound. But initially, what was happening when these were new, quite a few of them were coming back, more so than any of the Techniques, any of the Yamaha or Luxman. And we couldn't figure out why, and it was almost always the same thing, blown outputs. And what we figured out was this. People were buying these instead of buying a 50 or an 80 watt amplifier. If they would have bought something that was larger and heavier, bigger power supply, bigger heat sink, and back in the 80s, I mean, you listened to loud rock with lots of bass. I mean, I was one of those crazy young guys too. And you always push, every time you ran your stereo system, you ran it to the max. And that's what was killing these. It's basically a 20 watt amplifier. And people were pushing it right to the limit. And these didn't quite have the heat dissipation for it. The power envelope circuitry, which gave it extra boost on the two rails, it gave a little more output on the peaks, but it wasn't meant to be driven that hard. The other thing that used to happen with these, I'll just show you the other side. This is what I like about them now. They're so easy to take apart. You can take the top off and the bottom off, and you have access to every solder joint except for a couple under this brace, which you can take the screws off. I recap this one, and as I go along and recap, if I see any bad solder joints, I redo them. Well, I redid quite a few. They were a little bit light on the soldering. So that's just what I do in any amp that I rebuild. Interesting enough, these green capacitors, the Elites, many of them were glued down with the brown glue. You can actually see on this one, if I bring it in, there's corrosion right under the shrink wrap that's on here. The can was actually corroding. And when you recap one of these, you've got to get the brown goo off the board. If you don't, you're going to have problems. And I noticed, like under this one is actually leaking oil. This is one of the 4700s. This TPO, otherwise it was still good. These green capacitors, and there are a lot of them. A lot of 10s, a lot of 47s. Many of them bad. When the unit was only a few years old, they weren't the best. So a lot of these, and what's interesting about these is, these seem to be coming out of the woodwork now. This I bought from the original owner who had bought it 30 years ago and didn't play it that hard, listened to it occasionally. In more recent years, stopped listening to it because of the most common problem that develops over the years, the power switch. This is an Alps power switch. It's actually two switches in one. At the front is a muting circuit, low voltage, and then you have the actual AC portion of the switch. And it looks, when you open it up, it looks like a pair of contact points from an old distributor. You know, where they used to have single points, and in the Hemi Cuda they had doubles. You'll know what I'm talking about if you're from my era. And the contact points, if they're not burnt and arced out, you can clean them up, put a new capacitor on it, a little bit of grease in it. It's a little bit like doing brain surgery on a beaver, getting this switch apart and back together. But there are alternatives out there that will bolt in if you want to replace it completely. But what's interesting about these is I actually like working on them now because I'm an older guy. you know, if I'm working on a 40 or 30-pound amplifier or receiver, it's like, oh, I can't believe this. I got to carry it to the bench. And it's, you know, it's just, I find even just turning it around and moving it around on the bench is hard on the back. Where back when I was 25 years old, it was just like, oh, I can carry 3 of those. These are pretty light, the construction, the metal's light. Of course, they have the plastic faceplate. And I remember at the time, we're looking at these going, it's a plastic faceplate. Shouldn't it be aluminum with machined aluminum knobs? Well, they cut the cost in the cosmetic on these, but the circuitry, and you know, we're getting, this is mid-80s, but they built these relatively the same up until more recent years. There are no ICs in this. It's all discrete, right through the phono stage. And even the, in areas where they could have done it, like in the phono stage, many other amps at the time, like the Techniques, had those SDK modules instead of actual bolt-down TO3 cased output transistors. And so this at the time, this was the way to do it. This was proven. The older Pioneers, the older Kenwoods, the older Sensuis, Yamahas were all built this way. But by the mid-80s, actually only NAD and Onkyo were like this. And I think it has a benefit in sound, especially and in serviceability, but in sound, each stage is the bias is very tightly biased. Of course, it's capacitor coupled. That goes without saying. Some of the Luxmans at the time actually were LED coupled in the dual beta circuit. But over the years, we've never really gotten rid of the capacitors in an amp. And that's the weakest link. So this one's all recapped. And I've done the testing, set up the bias. And here's another tip on NAD. Anybody that's set the bias one of these knows on the solder side of the board, so you got to take all of the case off, the bottom plate off. You've got to undo the little solder land, which puts this 1 ohm resistor into the output stage, which is in series with the output transistors. And then you put a meter here. You read, you know, it's supposed to be 26 to 30 millivolts. You adjust it with this pot. Well, what I do is after I open the solder land at the back, I leave it. And then when I'm done setting it, I just solder a little jumper on here. So down the line, and you know, every few years you should check the bias on an amp because things drift, especially if it starts running hot. So you don't have to take the bottom case off. You just take the top off. You know, lift the one jumper off if you have a soldering iron, and you can check the bias, adjust it, put it back, and you're good to go. There's also a 0-volt adjustment for the outputs because they're direct coupled outputs. That's easy enough to do with a digital multimeter. And that's about it on tips and tricks for NAD. Thanks for watching and listening.